If you had to make up a story of how you think God would come down to earth, it probably wouldn't be the story of the Bible. The story of the Bible continually shocks me and my expectations of the way I think things ought to go, right? If at the center of our faith, the Christian faith, is the idea that God became a man, and that God had become a man in the person of Jesus to bring in this new kingdom, this new way of being. And in this kingdom, there would be forgiveness of sins, and there would be renewed relationships, and there would be just all things being brought together and reconciled, peace and harmony and love and kindness and compassion. And it was supposed to be this wonderful new enterprise. And the way that God decided to come to earth wasn't through some great big parade or some great big celebration or some great big, hey, I'm here, right? MTV wasn't there. There was no He comes in a manger. He comes in a lot of ways in anonymity. No celebrity, but in anonymity. And that's shocking because Jesus was God made visible, and yet his life was an exercise in being and living invisibly in many ways. In Mark, one of the gospel stories of Jesus, Mark 1:35 tells us a story of how Jesus gets up very early in the morning. It's still dark out. He goes out to a desolate place to pray. There's no one around. There's no one who can see him. Simon Peter, one of his followers, goes looking for him and says in verse 37, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus' response, "Let's move on to the next city." It's an astonishing way of being if you think about it. He is here to heal the world, forgive sinners, and tell people about God. But when the crowds start getting too big, he's ready to bounce to the next spot. It's not exactly a great way to gain momentum for a movement. He's not out there shaking hands with the elite. He's not out there trying to be important or just talk to the somebodies. In fact, he's constantly hiding and moving in mystery. The allure of praise, fame, celebrity, adoration, applause doesn't have his heart. He's not looking to be seen and noticed and acknowledged. In fact, his story can be one of anonymity, secrecy, going unnoticed, hiding right beneath the eyes of all except for God. I mean, think about this. God showed up on earth and no one even knew he was God for the most part for about 30 years of his life. I mean, it took 30 years for him to go, okay, guys, let me let the cat out of the bag. I'm actually here to save the universe. You know what I mean? Like, that's wild, right? People grew up with him, didn't like they were at, preschool together. Like, you ain't gonna save the world. You see you run around in diapers, man. And it was just a shocking way that he would live most of his life under this kind of hiding, mysterious way of being. And so one pastor says this about the Christian life. Being remembered by God means we no longer fear being forgotten by the world. Living humanly within his remembrance is enough. That's how Jesus lived. And that's what he spent his time doing. In fact, he not only lived kind of in anonymity, but he met with a bunch of anonymous randos. Like, have you read the gospel stories? The people he's shaking hands with and spending time with, they're not like the cultural elite. He mostly, avoids them. Like, every time the religious guys get in the room, he's like, okay, here we go, and he starts calling them bad names like snakes, right? He saves and talks to the sexually broken, the sex workers of his time, right? He talks to the tax collectors, okay, which are equally evil, IRS. He talks to, just the horrible, worst people in his society. He's healing the lepers. They're a whole community just separate because they're, contagious. And he goes and moves towards them and talks to them when no one else is talking to them. And he continues to move out on the disenfranchised and broken people. He moves towards them. And then when he raises up his followers and sends them out into ministry, he doesn't send them to the high points of the cultural kind of elite places. He sends them out to do the same thing he was doing. He says, go help the people I've been helping. Be like me. That's what he says. And he pushes them out into the world to go meet and greet these anonymous nobodies. He says, go do what I've done. And they're thrilled. In fact, they're so thrilled, they say, Jesus, we're so pumped. We were casting out demons. We were healing people. We did it all. And Jesus' only response to them is, he says, do not rejoice that the demons listen to you. Rejoice that your name is written in the book of life. Kind of weird. What Jesus is saying is he's teaching his followers, he's teaching us something very important. He's saying, listen, we can get so excited about what God's doing through us that we forget to be excited about what God is doing in us. See, Jesus' whole life was about cultivating an inner life with God so that he did not need the praise of others and he was not torn down by the criticism of others. His heart doesn't swell with praise and it doesn't break at criticism because he had time with God alone where he was fortified by God's love. He was more excited, Jesus was, about what God was doing in him and with him than what God was doing through him. Jesus knew, listen, that ministry isn't everything. A relationship with God is. Jesus knew that it was more important to have a connection with God than it was to be known for doing big, famous, large things in the eyes of others. A pastor named Martin Lloyd-Jones, who was basically internationally known and a speaker and had done much amazing ministry in the UK and Great Britain and stuff, he was getting into the twilight of his life. Kind of, his body was falling apart. He was diseased and sick, and he would die shortly. And his biographer was kind of following him around for the last months of his life. And his biographer was really interested in how was he going to handle death. It's easy sometimes to handle life, especially when life comes with fame and celebrity and kind of status. But how do we handle the moments where that is, fallen through our hands? How do we face death? And so he asked him once, he said, I'm writing the biography on your life, and I just want to know, how are you dealing with the fact that you no longer have this status in the world, that people don't go to you and ask you to preach at their conferences, and they're not coming to you asking you to write books for them anymore. How are you dealing with the reality that you are no longer the celebrity, the big famous man on stage? And he only quoted back to them, do not rejoice if the demons listen, but rejoice that your name is written in the book of life. See, Martin Lloyd-Jones, the thing that made his ministry so effective, so powerful, the reason why God had entrusted that platform to him was because he didn't care about the platform and praise. He cared about the interior life with God. If he had none of that, he would still have this. And therefore he was stable and he moved about in mystery and secrecy. And that was the life of Jesus. To the point where John the Baptizer, this guy who would, supposed to be his hype man. Jesus had a hype man. I don't know if you knew that. You guys know that? Jesus had a hype man. John the Baptizer. And this guy comes saying, hey everybody, God's come to save the world. He's coming after me. This guy's awesome. That was John the Baptizer's his whole ministry. And there's a point where Jesus is doing all this stuff, but it doesn't look like nothing's happening. You know what I mean? He's kind of confused. He's like, well, he likes hanging out with really broken, bad people, and I don't really know. And so at the point where John the Baptizer is like, you know what? I got to figure this out, man. So he gets one of his followers and says, go ask Jesus if he's the one, or should I look for another? He's about to sell stock in Jesus' ministry. You know what I mean? He's all in, hype man. He's looking at his ministry from afar. He's like, yo, that don't look messianic, you know? These guys just walking around eating with everybody. I mean, this is hometown buffet. This ain't ministry, bro. It's like he's confused and he's disoriented, and it just makes me stop and go, what is it about us that when we see the ordinary, regular life of Jesus meeting with nobodies, that we all want to sell stock on Jesus and go, there has to be a better way than living among messy, anonymous nobodies. Like, I want something fast and famous and big and large. And so it's disorienting for John the Baptizer to see a ministry of Jesus that is built on anonymity and secrecy and mystery. And it confused Jesus' family as well. At one point, because Jesus' family now has been hearing these things that Jesus is saying, I'm the Messiah who's come to save the world. Like, no, you're not, knucklehead, right? You know what I mean? Like, that's like the vibe that keeps getting in his hometown and with his family. No one kind of buys it. And so at one point, his brothers literally say, in John 7:4, they say, no one works in secret if they want to be known openly. Show yourself to the world. And there's a feast coming up at this point. So they're basically like, okay, now's the time to shine, bro. You want to show us your messianic ministry? This is the perfect platform. And then Jesus responds to them, my time has not come. And he waits a couple of days, and the Bible says after his brothers had gone up to the feast, he went up, but not publicly, but privately. There's another point in the Gospels where Jesus transfigures, and it's basically where he goes up onto this mountain and he reveals that he's actually God in the flesh. He's not just a human, he's God in all of his glory. But here's the thing, he only takes his inner three best friends, and all of a sudden he starts floating, right? Which ain't a normal Tuesday. He starts floating, and then his glory starts being revealed. And everyone's like shocked by it. Like one Old Testament prophet shows up, another one does. God's voice is booming. God in all of his glory. The guys who are like his best friends, like, we ain't never seen this before, right? They all start falling on their face worshiping. And then Peter starts going, let's build tents. You get a tent, you get a tent, you get a tent. He turns into Oprah, right? It's just super weird. Like he's disoriented by the experience. He has no categories for what he's seeing. Jesus comes down, and Jesus' first words after that encounter is, don't tell anybody. What? If I see a brother levitate, that's going on Twitter. You know what I'm saying? Like ASAP. And Jesus says, don't tell anyone what you just seen. It is confusing. The radical commitment Jesus tells to constantly telling people when he does something amazing and miraculous, shh, just keep this between us. Let's not let this get out of hand. Don't tell anyone. He heals someone. Don't tell anyone what I did for you. He raises the dead. Don't tell anyone. Shh. He preaches an amazing sermon. Lives will change. Just try to keep it to yourself, will you? I mean, it's like he's trying to kill momentum. At one point, he feeds 5,000 people with a Lunchables. That's how I read it. It's basically a Lunchables. It's like a couple fish, couple loaves. Boom, 5,000 people are fed. Right? And the popularity is growing around this platform, and all the people are like, yo, let's make this guy king. Like, let's make this guy, like vote for Jesus. That's what they all start saying, right? They get a platform going. They're ready just to elect him as the next king. And the Bible says in John 6, perceiving that they were going to come and take him by force and try to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Jesus sees the crowds clamoring for his popularity, his celebrity, his status to be known and noticed and seen. And Jesus goes, it's time for me to bow out and go pray with God. It's time for me to exit left. And when they find him, finally, he literally has to go hide. He gets on a boat and tries to sneak away. They find him. They're like running after him, like, where you been at, Jesus? It's breakfast time. You know, they're like, all right, they're looking for Jesus, and then Jesus says, man, you guys aren't looking for me for the right reasons. You guys seek me just because you got your bread. You guys want this convenient miracle worker. You want a glorified baker, performer, but I've come to satisfy the real hunger of every human heart. And then Jesus just doubles down and says, man, here's the truth. I came not just to be like conveniently beside you, but I came to be the God of your entire life. And they get mad. They're like, this guy said he's manna from heaven. Who does he think he, like, they're just confused. And then Jesus says, yeah, the reason why you guys don't like what I'm saying is because God the Father hasn't revealed that to you. In other words, he says, your hearts can't take what I'm saying because you've not spent time with God. You don't really know God, or else you'd know me. And at this point, Jesus fed 5,000 men, and women and children and all. People estimate maybe 10, 15,000 people there, all right? There are Mexicans in the crowds, it's like at least 35,000, because, you know, we got like 10 kids each, right? So, I mean, this is a big group, right? And in an instant, Jesus says to them straight up, look, you guys don't really want me. You guys want what I can give you, but not me. In an instant, the Bible says, they all get up and walk away. Okay, if this church, Gateway, was rocking like 5,000 on a Sunday, all right? We have 52 services because it's only 2 services because it only fits like 25 people, right? But like we're rocking 5,000 people at our church, right? I get up and I preach a bomb, like it's just a terrible sermon. And the next Sunday we show up and there's 12 people sitting here in the pews. How many of you rolling with me? How many of you are in the 12 with me? Like, Joe, I'm with you. Don't lie to me, okay? No, you guys are talking about me on Facebook. That sermon was terrible. This dude lost 5,000 people overnight. And Jesus don't even seem bothered by it. Jesus then turns to his 12 and he says to them, are you guys going to leave too? And they say, we don't got anywhere to go. We're all in on you, Jesus. But here's the question I'm asking when I read that story. I'm thinking, what is it about the character of Jesus that he can say the truth even if 5,000 people are going to walk away from him? Like, what is the interior strength of the heart to be able to disappoint 5,000 people and look at the last guys he has going on his side and say, you guys want to walk away too? Well, Jesus was not allured by the crowds and by celebrity and by fear of man. He actually cared more about what God thought than what people thought. And that allowed him to do amazing, courageous things like say the truth when no one's willing to say it. That his time as he knelt before God allowed him to stand before anybody. Because he had developed an interior life. Some people say, I think the reason why Jesus didn't want himself to, be known, he wanted to be anonymous, was because he didn't want his ministry to get out of hand. He wanted to focus on preaching. Maybe that's it. I get it. I mean, you see it today. Celebrities are stormed at the grocery stores. They can't even do basic things. Maybe he wanted to move about in freedom. Or maybe the reason why Jesus was so committed to keeping his ministry on the down low was actually because Jesus was obeying the command that he would later give us in Matthew 6:1. That command being, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. See, Jesus, when he taught in the greatest sermon ever, the Sermon on the Mount, he got up and he said, you guys want to know what's a real trap for your spirituality? You want to know what's a real trap for your faith life? It's when your whole faith is lived out in the public eye. He says, be careful if you're only doing good things so that other people can see what you're doing. Be careful that all you want is status and credibility and reputation and the eyes and acknowledgement of outsiders. He says, if the main point of your relationship with God is that others can see that you're a good person, he says, you're in hypocrisy land. See, Jesus lived his whole ministry in secrecy and anonymity and privacy with God because that was the point of his connection to God. It was that and not everything else. And it's utterly astonishing that Jesus is advocating for this low profile, unsexy, unnoticed, deeply personal, secret relationship with God. And here's what I want to say to us today, church. Heart failure happens when the majority of our spiritual lives is lived out in the public eye for public consumption. What I'm saying is, if your faith is mainly about what others are noticing and seeing about you and not primarily how you are experiencing God in privacy, you will not make it. Because the point of our faith is not supposed to be a virtue signal, look how good of a person I am, a reputation, but rather an actual connection with the living God. And you can't fake that for very long. You can't fake that for very long. We are supposed to live our lives in the presence of God where we can't pretend, perform, and try to act better than we truly are. Instead, we should live right in front of the face of God and hear from God his love for us. That's what Jesus did. When Jesus launched his public ministry, when he started telling people about, God and the kingdom and all these things, he heard this message from God the Father. God the Father said, you are my beloved Son, and I'm well pleased with you. God the Father spoke those words over his life. What a blessing. And I can't imagine that was the first time Jesus was hearing that. That was the first time the public heard that. But I think the reason why Jesus has to get away from the crowds every now and then and go to a desolate place to pray is because he needed his heart to be reminded that that was who he was. He needed a place to get away from all the opinions and the public polls. He needed a place where he didn't have to live in front of the eyes of others, and he could live right before the eyes of God and say, God, who am I when it's just me and you? And when it's just God and Jesus, what God says to him is, you're my beloved child and I'm pleased with you. And Jesus had to hear that deep in his heart before he can go out and move and help others, because he had to be fortified and secure and safe in his identity with God in private. The point is, Jesus made it a point not to get his identity from public opinion, but from personal encounter. Jesus made it the point of his life to get his identity not from public opinion, but a private encounter with God. And that made him secure. So here's the point. If you want to become like Jesus, well, you're not swayed by fear of man or by the reputation they can offer you. If you want to become like Jesus, you must learn to be with Jesus. Spend time in his presence so that you can get what he had, which is the security of relationship that he had with God. Because the reality is people rub off on you, and that's what we've been talking about this whole series. That we have to spend time with Jesus in his word and prayer, and then we will become like Jesus. Let me put it differently. If you want the lifestyle of Jesus, you need the life of Jesus. Oh, flip that. If you want the life of Jesus, you need the lifestyle of Jesus. That is, if you want the good life that Jesus says you can have, you need the practices that Jesus had. And as we begin to spend time with Jesus and see him as he is, we will begin to become like him, more convinced that what God says about us is more stable than what others are saying about us. Jesus says, don't practice your righteousness in front of everyone's eyes. He says, get away with God and see what happens to your heart. Get away with God and see what happens to your heart. And he contrasts two kinds of people in Matthew 6. He says there's some people, the only reason they go to church, the only reason they do good things, the only reasons they have character is because they're hoping someone catches them doing good. They're hoping someone notices how holy they are. He says, man, those guys are the worst. They're the hypocrites. They're the hypocrites we can never become. He says, beware of practicing your righteousness as a platform in front of others for others to notice. He says, instead, go and do it in secret. Because then it's just you and God, and it's all real there, man. It's all real there. He gives 3 examples. He says, whenever you give, don't sound the trumpet, right? Some people are like, time to tithe, everybody. Like, don't be that guy. Okay, look at it. Look at this homeless man. Here we go, Instagram, right? Don't do that. He says, what if you actually gave and didn't let anyone know what you were doing? If you are generous and no one notices, were you still generous? Oh, more so, because no one knows, and now you're not getting the credibility of being known as a generous person. So he says, instead of giving and blowing the trumpet every time you're about to do something, not so everyone goes, oh, what's going on over there, and look at you. He says, what if you didn't even know what your left hand didn't even know what your right hand was doing? I don't know how much I gave, because my left hand didn't tell my right hand. Like, that's the image, right? Like, I don't even know the good I'm doing myself, because I'm not trying to think about me, but what I'm doing is not for me, but it's for the sake of blessing the other. There's some people in this church, one of their favorite phrases, and they're the most generous people in this church, I know. They'll say, don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. Say it all. I can't even say their name because they'll get mad at me. But that's what they do. And that drives their generosity, and it's evident that they ain't trying to get praised. They ain't trying to get noticed. They ain't trying to get seen. They ain't trying to get power or cred. They just want to be generous like God's called them to be generous. Now, the religious hypocrites here, they honor God with their lips, but their hearts are far from God. So they want the outward appearance of righteousness, but not the internal integrity that is built by time with him. Later, Jesus says, you guys strain out gnats and you choke on a camel. The idea was in the book of Leviticus, first half of the Bible, there were all these rules, right? Standards rules of what you couldn't get and do. Well, one of the rules is you couldn't eat certain insects. And so what they do is when they're drinking their water, before drinking like a glass of water, they would put it through a strain in case there were any gnats that jumped in there, which is kind of good to do anyways. But still, they would make sure there are no gnats, and there was this big saying, oh, we got to make sure there's no gnats in here. But then they go, oh, they're swallowing a camel. It's an image that Jesus is like making fun of them, right? He's like, bro, you guys are, every time you drink water on a gnat, and you're like, oh, you're just swallowing a camel. By the way, gnats are the worst, right? You're just walking around in public, like just like a normal day, like, and you look like the invisible man just assaulted you, okay? That's another sermon for something else. I don't know what that's for. But Jesus says, that's how you look, man. You're like making sure you don't eat those gnats. And you're swallowing a camel wholesale like you're a boa constrictor, right? It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And Jesus says, instead of caring about what's noticeable and like, what if you actually cared about becoming a righteous person instead of caring about being known as a righteous person? He says, some of you love to pray in public. Whenever it's prayer meeting, you're there. Not because you actually love to pray, but because you actually like to be known as someone who prays. He says, some of you, every time you fast, you don't eat for a little bit, you make sure everyone knows it. Right? You tell everyone, you look all sad. What's wrong? Oh, I'm just so hungry, right? Been fasting for the Lord for you pagans, right? Like that's how you look. And everyone's like, okay, like there's, and they want to be known as a person who does holy, righteous things. And Jesus says, what if you didn't let your left hand know what your right hand was doing? What if every time you prayed, you didn't do it in public, you went into your closet when no one could see you? What if every time you fasted, you actually cleaned up your face so no one could tell you were fasting? I've been fasting for 42 weeks. Look at me. I'm just playing. I'm just saying. That's not part of the sermon. But what if every time you did something holy, you didn't get an applause and notice and eyes of others, but you actually did it because it was what God was calling you to do because you had spent time with him? Here's what Jesus says. When it comes to the religious hypocrite, their reward is the reputation of man. Religious people are more consumed with reputation than righteousness. Religious people are more concerned with valuing perception than people. Religious people are more concerned with being impressive than being honest. Religious people are more concerned with being noticed than being known. And Jesus says they're hypocrites. They have no real integrity because they're actually not what they're performing and pretending that they are. Because they constantly practice their righteousness on a platform for everyone to notice and acknowledge. And that's their reward. Everyone sees them. They perform and the crowd goes wild. The crowd goes, look how holy they are. And Jesus says, all right, you can have that. But one day I'm going to meet you and I'm going to know that you didn't do any of that for me. You did that for you and you got what you wanted. But if you want my eyes, why don't you spend time where only I can see you? The invitation of a God is, if you want my eyes on your life, why don't you spend time in places and moments where only I'm the one seeing you? Because then all of your reasons for doing good go out the window if it's all for a public show, right? Because you're not faking the funk with Jesus. And so when you develop an interior life like Jesus had, all of the reasons for performing and pretending are gone because God sees and knows the real you. I like to talk about PDA Christians, public displays of affection Christians. I've been this person in the past, and honestly, when I went to Bible college, I would see this sometimes with people who were very publicly affectionate with God. They were on their face and crying, but their lives, their interior lives were just a mess. And on one level, I'm like, well, maybe they just felt really broken, and I didn't want to judge anyone worshiping, right? Because I know I'm a sinner too, but part of me wondered, how much of their life was it a show, a performance, so that they got the cred? Like, hey, I'm holy, I'm worshiping God full-heartedly. Did they actually have time like that alone in Jesus, where they were in that same posture, broken before God? I guess I won't ever know, and no one should know, but the reality is they had public displays of affection, but no private interior lives. I knew some people for sure who that was true of, right? They even walked away from the faith. Just think about that in like any other relationship. Imagine there was a couple that was always all over each other. They're always like macking. And they were like holding hands. They were all on each other. You know, macking's like bigger than just kissing, right? Like they were just all over each other all the time in public. And it kind of got to the point where you're like, it's a little excessive, but I guess they're just lovers. They're into each other. And then you found out later on they actually hate each other. They don't talk. They sleep in separate beds. They get in the room like, oh, I'm glad the day's over, so I don't have to be with you anymore. If you found out that they had that going on in the public, but in private their life was a mess, there'd be some like dissonance. You'd be like, yo, you're a hypocrite. You're acting one type of way in front of everybody's eyes, but then when you get quiet, like that ain't even real. And God says that some of us, that's what we're doing. In the public's eye, we act a certain way, and then in the privacy of our own homes, when we unbutton and kind of act who we really are, it all comes out. And what comes out is not an authentic connection to God. What comes out is sin and slothfulness and harshness and rudeness and disrespect and lack of compassion. That's really why the ultimate test for many of us of your relationship with God is not what the strangers think about you, but what the people who know you best and closest think about you. Now, sometimes, you you're in a family situation where maybe people are just being harsh to you. I get that. But largely, the mark of a good man is not what the public will shout about him, but what his friends and his family and the people who spent life with him in private can say about him. That's scary for someone whose life is lived on this platform in many ways. Because I will not be judged by this platform, but by that platform and by my kids and by the life lived behind the scenes and no one else sees. That's why Jesus said not many of you should become teachers. Because there's a weight and responsibility that comes with having integrity or not. And the invitation of Jesus for all of us then is to have a life of integrity where it's not just a show and a performance, and it's not just for others to see. And again, I'm going to pick on my crowd because we're the ones in ministry, right? But like, there's some stuff that happens with pastors when you get into ministry that kind of scares me. Like pastors get a preacher voice. You guys know what I'm talking about? They talk like normal people, and then they get up here, and they're like, oh, and it's like, what's going on? What happened to your voice? You got a holy voice all of a sudden, you know? They're like, thou shalt not. And they start speaking in King James language. And so like, as much as I can avoid, I try to have the same kind of voice that I have as a human being when I'm up here, because I'm still the same human being. And I try to locate myself every time I come up here to be who I am with integrity, because I know that it's easy for me to slip into preacher voice. I just turn around and here we go, everybody. I'm ready to go. Thou shalt not, start praying for people and casting out demons, right? And there's a certain public performance that can happen that is what Jesus is warning against. And here's what he says. He says, when you're doing that, you're actually not becoming righteous. You're becoming convincing. And you're convincing others of a reputation that you actually don't have on the interior. And what that's actually fueling is the deepest sin of all. The deepest sin underneath every sin is the sin of pride. It's the sin of vanity. The sin of, I am a holy, righteous, good person. That's why Jesus had his strongest rebukes for the religious elite, because of their pride, because of their vanity. And they would use their pride to kill sin. And if you use sin to kill sin, you're still a sinner. If you use sin to kill sin, you're still a sinner, because sin cannot kill sin. So we water our pride, and then we wonder why our lives are still a mess. And it's because we actually didn't want to uproot our sin. We wanted to appear as if we were uprooting it. And it's so much harder work to fake that than to actually become what God's calling us to become. But in order to become what God's calling us to become, we have to commit to spending time with God when no one else is watching. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus calls out the Pharisees, the religious leaders of his time. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus straight up calls out the religious leaders of his time, and he begins to just unload and unleash on them, because he's tired of the religious complex that rewards people for religious public activity. So here's what he says in Matthew 23. He says to the Pharisees, they preach, but they don't practice. They tie up heavy burdens that are hard to bear, and they lay them on people, but they won't even lift a finger to help them. They do all their deeds so that others can see them. They wear these long robes and these fringe long things so you can notice them. They want the best seat in the synagogue. They want the best seat in the marketplace. They want others to call them rabbi. And Jesus goes on to say, but you're not supposed to call each other rabbi and teacher and give each other these honored titles. Call each other brother. You're on the same level. Don't ask someone, call me teacher, because the truth is you have one teacher, and that's Jesus. The greatest among you is a servant. If you try to exalt yourself, you're going to be humbled. But if you humble yourself, God will exalt you. And then he goes on and say, you know, the thing about religious people, they shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. They travel all across the land and the sea to try to make one convert. And when they do, that person becomes twice a son of hell as they are. He says, man, you guys are blind guides. You're leading people into blindness. And he goes on and on and on. He says, you guys don't care about the big things that matter to God's heart, like justice and mercy and compassion. You guys care about tithes and offerings, because that's lining your pockets. He says, you wash the outside, but not the inside of the cup. He says, you're like a whitewashed tomb. The outside of the tomb, oh, it looks so good, but the inside, dead men walking. You outwardly appear righteousness, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. You say, if we had lived back in the day when all the prophets were here, we would have never killed them. And the irony is these are the ones who will mount up and kill Jesus himself. So then he looks at them and says, you snakes, how are you going to escape being sentenced to hell? Jesus says, the thing about the ministry of the Pharisees is they preach without practicing. They burden others without lifting a finger to help. They care more about their reputation than righteousness. They demand respect but have no integrity. They feel entitled to their title, and they love the applause of people, and they are desperately afraid of what others think of them. They make heaven feel far away, and they make that path so narrow with so many obstacles that no one thinks they can make it. They love ministering with distance, but not to the people nearest, not to the everyday neighbor. They outwardly look clean and alive, but inwardly they're dead and filthy. They think they are better than others when they're actually worse. Here's how we can describe them as people. They are proud, power-hungry, entitled, title-loving, inconsistent, self-righteous, upright, judgmental, defensive, reputation-obsessed, religious, hypocritical jerks. They're far worse than the most far sinner you know, but it's far more subtle, so you probably would never recognize it. That's how Jesus feels about the religious elite of his time. Welcome to Gateway Church. We love to encourage you here, okay? But here's why Jesus is so viciously attacking that kind of mindset, because of the impact they have on others. They make people feel small and less than, controlled, abused. They make people feel uptight when they get around, nervous. They're crushing, they're exhausting. God feels so inaccessible, far and unloving. Like God's so disappointed in them because they are. And God's always just shaking his head at them. And God's so ashamed and impatient with them. The thing about this group is because they're constantly putting on a show and pretending like they're better than they are, they make everyone else feel like they'll never measure up, so why even give God a try? Now, I want you to contrast that with the big verse we've been talking about in this series. The invitation of Jesus, who, looking out at the Pharisees, putting on the show. And this is so gracious of Jesus, man. He loves even the Pharisee, even the religious performer, to the point where he actually invites them to rest. He looks out at them and he sees them working and trying to earn God's way and trying to get a reputation. And that's exhausting, you know? Who wants to live that kind of life? And Jesus says to them, come to me. All of you who are tired, come to me. If you are just burdened, I'll give you rest. Take my yoke, learn from me. I'm going to be right here with you, helping. I'm gentle and lowly of heart. My burden is easy and light. Jesus says, come to me. It's so invitational. Just come. What I got to do to have a relationship with God? Just come to me. Spend time with me. Open, spacious, generous, wide, inclusive, lavish, free relationship. Personal. Come to me. Connect with me. Spend time with me. You know, when the manager says, let me take care of you, it's like the main guy is going to personally attend to you. Jesus says, come to me and I'll take care of you right here. And I'll unburden you. You're burdened, you're crushed, you're guilty, you're heavy. Let me take that off of you and put it onto me. And he says, let's yoke ourselves together and let's walk together through life and let me teach you the light way. Because right now you look so burdened and heavy by rules and regulations and appearance and reputation. And that reputation that you love to uphold, it's actually crushing you. Just take it off. And he says, and I'll teach you. I'll teach you how to walk so your life is light. I'll teach you how to walk so that your life is easy. The mature Christian is able to do what's right from their heart effortlessly because they've lived a life with Jesus. It's not hard for them to do the right thing. Not because they're inherently good, but because they spent years of time with Jesus, and now their gut reaction is what's right and good from the heart. They don't have to try to be pure. They're pure of heart. They don't got to try to have compassion. They're just compassionate in their character. They don't have to try to be generous. They can't even hold on to their money if they wanted to, because they've spent time with the one who has integrity, Jesus, and he's taught them how to have integrity. Integrity is built in the secret place with God. That's where it's built. Not in the public space, but in the secret place. And Jesus is saying the Pharisees are completely unlike me. And here's what I think, church. I say this a lot and I mean it. I want our church to feel like really good news for really bad sinners. I want people who don't have any connection to God or even any church background or any kind of, maybe they even feel like God feels really far or distant or like, I want those people to come here and be like, I can vibe with these people. I can be a part of this group. And they may not be anything like you, but they look at you and they see something about your life. It's so humanizing and has so much integrity. And you're not perfect, but you're willing to name the places you're not perfect. And you're on a journey and you're inviting them. Why don't you come with me and follow Jesus? He's so kind. And they can see that realness in your life. So I want our church to feel like a space where it's really good news for really bad sinners. Because Jesus has called us to be like him. He says, if your brother is in sin, you who are spiritual, restore him in a spirit of gentleness. It says, bear one another's burdens. In other words, be like Jesus and take the load off of people. Don't put it on people. And so we say this all the time. The way you know you've encountered someone who spent time with Jesus is when you're with them, you feel lighter, not heavier. You feel unburdened, not burdened. You feel, I think I could breathe again. I feel alive again. I feel like I can make it. I feel like I can keep fighting in faith because I spent time with them and they seem to have the life that I need. And it's because they actually had time with Jesus where they resourced themselves and now they're giving that to you. And what you're experiencing through them is the love of Jesus. So the best gift you can give your neighbor, your friend, your spouse, your kids is the person you're becoming. The best gift you can offer them is becoming a person of integrity because you spent time in the secret place, not in the public space. You spent time in the secret space cultivating life with Jesus. And then, therefore, because of that time, you've become like him. And so now when people are around you, like, I don't know what it is, but when I'm around you, I just feel loved. I feel like you actually see me. People don't even listen to each other anymore. But when I'm with you, I feel like you feel me and you're with me and I don't know what it is about your presence. And that person would say, it's because it's not my presence, but his presence. And I've spent time in it and I'm with it now and I'm offering it to you. I'll tell you the truth. I didn't always have this way of looking at ministry. In many ways, I told you, this whole sermon series is like my selfish attempt to connect my heart to God in deeper ways. And so this is like you guys are listening in on like my private prayer journal right now. Like, God, cultivate the internal prayer life of my heart. Cultivate me with you in the private place, not in the public space. Cultivate real connection with you, God. But even a desire for this was not always the way I did ministry and thought about life. It wasn't until I got to college. I grew up in a very religious, kind of Baptist, uptight background. And so I was really good at performing. I was like a little messiah. Everyone had all their hopes and dreams on me to be the guy to deliver us from the ghetto. I don't know. It was like there's a lot of pressure on me. I felt like, right, to like be this like perfect little pastor kid, and it made me self-righteous and judgmental. And when I got to college, I had a professor, and the professor had made a challenge to the whole class, and he said, "I want you to pretend like you're in the story of the Bible and put yourself as one of the characters." It's like, bet, I'll do that. And so I started reading my Bible. And when I was reading my Bible, I was putting myself in the story of Jesus and like walking with Jesus. I'm like, okay, I'm not Jesus. I'm not that dumb, okay? I'm not that character. But then I was like, well, who am I? And what terrified me is that every turn, I was the religious person that was always judging the person Jesus was protecting. Like if I was being honest, I looked at the stories and I was like, okay, I don't identify with that person who's really broken. I identify with that person who thinks they're really good. And Jesus was always against them and for them, and that scared me. And I realized I actually was that person all along. I just thought I was that person. I was the broken, the far off, the disenfranchised, the impoverished in my soul. I was exhausted by that. But I was trying to pretend and perform I was actually more together than I was. And it took a time where I had to actually begin to say, I don't want to fake this. I don't want to have to go my whole life pretending I'm someone I'm not, which means I'm going to have to put down the Pharisee way of life where reputation consumes me, where the fear of man guides me, where I'm so concerned about what people might say about me if I'm actually honest. And I want to actually cultivate the brokenness that would bring me right into the presence of God. I want to cultivate the secret place. Or to use Jesus' terms, I want to seek the kingdom of God and his righteousness. I had to realize that I'm already discovered. And so are you. A lot of you are waiting to be discovered. You're waiting to be discovered by someone looking for you, some job, some title, some position. You're some recruiter. You're waiting for them to notice you, to see you. You're waiting to be discovered. Some of you are waiting to be discovered by a partner. You think, man, if I can just get that girl or that guy to notice me, to see me, if I can just get that one to see me, you're waiting to be discovered. And the gospel is you're already discovered. You're already seen. You're already known. You already are found and loved. Don't listen to the fairy tales. That man or woman will never come in and save your heart like you think they will. The reality is the fairy tale is true, except it's about Jesus and how he's discovered you. And so we have to cultivate our hearts then in the presence of God, in the secret place. Paul, talking to a young pastor, says it this way. 1 Timothy 4, he says, when bodily training is of some value, but godliness is valuable in every way. It holds promise for the present life and the life to come. This saying is trustworthy. You can accept it with your whole heart. This is why I work as hard as I do. That's what he says. Here's what Paul says to Timothy. He says, listen, if you want to be in ministry, if you want to live your life connected to God, he says you have to train your body the way you have to train your soul the way you train your body. So some of you guys, you love working out. You love working. You're in it, right? Like no one walks in the gym day one. It's like, boom, 400 pounds, no big deal, bro. No one does that, right? You work yourself up to it. I can do that, but most of you guys can't. You got to work yourself up to it, right? You start with something small, and maybe you do a couple of push-ups, and eventually you can get to my level. But most of us, out the gate, we're not that strong. It takes training. Why do you guys keep laughing at that? That's super offensive. It takes training. I just realized it. You guys keep laughing. It's weird. It takes training, intentionality, day in and day out. And it looks effortless. But if you go up to the guy in the pros, you go up to the all-star, you say, man, this is so, you must be so talented. They look at you and go, talented? I've worked my tail off. Talent is just that big of the rest of it's all work, man. The rest of it's all work. No one makes it on talent. No one just wakes up. And it's the same for your spiritual life. No one just wakes up, oh, they're holy, right? No one just, wakes up and just starts blessing people. Man, it takes, what the Bible would say is work out your salvation. It takes training. It takes discipline. But this discipline isn't to earn God's love. It's because you have God's love. This discipline is I want space in the quiet place so I can become instead of pretend. This discipline is how do I stay in the love of God and cultivate my relationship with him so I don't have to pretend like I'm holier than I am. See, the secret place, that time with God, eats away at self-righteousness, pretending, and performing. So let me ask you, church, have you developed a stamina to go unnoticed? Are you okay with being misunderstood? Can you tolerate being overlooked? Is it okay if sometimes your good deeds are invisible? How on earth did Jesus do everything that he did perfectly and then accept the fate where he was publicly shamed? How on earth could Jesus live a perfect life before the eyes of God and then get dragged out like he was the worst kind of sinner? How did that happen? That happened because he spent time in the secret place. The reason why Jesus was able to endure the lies of people as they crucified him is because he spent time in the presence of God. In fact, the night before he's crucified, Matthew 26, what is he doing? He's in the secret place. He's in the secret place in the presence of God. And he's sitting there in a garden called Gethsemane. Matthew 26:36. And he's looking at his followers. He says, sit down while I go over there and pray. He can't even be with his disciples. He says, I need to get really alone with God right now. And he goes, come on, Peter, you can come with me. He takes the two sons of Zebedee. And the Bible says he began to be really sorry and troubled. And he said, man, I'm so sorry in my heart, even to death. Stay here. Pray with me. And he goes off even a little further from them. And he falls on his face and he says, Father, if it's possible, let the cup of wrath go away from me. I don't want to pay for the sins of the world. Whatever you want, I'll do it. But man, this is hard for me. And he's wrestling and he's struggling in the garden, in the secret place. His honest heart is, God, this is going to be hard. I'm terrified. I'm traumatized that I have to go pay for the sins of the world. I don't know if I can do it. This is hard. And when he came back to his followers, he found them sleeping. He said to Peter, you couldn't pray for 1 hour with me? Pray for yourself so you don't fall into temptation. Your spirit is willing, but your flesh is weak. Why did Jesus endure the cross? And why did Peter run from the cross? Because Jesus stood up and prayed in the secret place. And Peter slept away his time in the secret place. And Peter goes on to deny Jesus 3 times. Before the rooster crows, 3 times he denies him. And the Bible says, and Peter wept so bitterly that night. He starts crying because he realizes, even though he was earlier in the night when Jesus says, hey guys, I'm going to be crucified for the sins of the world. Peter says, no, don't worry, I'll stay with you. We'll fight. He said, and Peter even throws his bros under the bus at that point. He says, they're going to leave you, but I'm going to stick with you. Jesus says, oh, you're going to be the first one to go. 3 times the rooster's going to crow, you're going to be gone, man. And when the rooster crows that 3rd time, Peter loses it because he realizes he didn't actually have time in the secret place. So he couldn't withstand the hour of trial. Because when the storms came, they washed him away because he never actually was what he was performing and pretending to be. And you know what? Jesus loves Peter. He loved Peter. Even though Peter was a hypocrite in a lot of ways. Even though Peter had not cultivated his inner life and was all pomp and show, he loved Peter. And so he goes to Peter and says, I'm going to restore you and give you another shot, Peter. And he changes Peter's whole life. And the whole direction of his ministry is marked. So here's the point. You may look at your life right now and be like, it's true, Joe. Most of my faith is lived out in public displays of affection. I don't pray. I don't read. I don't have time in the secret place right now. Jesus died for you. And he died knowing that you are not the person that he wants you to be. But guess what? He forgives you, and he wants to actually invite you back into that place and say, let's do it again. I'll walk with you. Just come to me. That's all you need. Just come to me, and I will help you. Sit with me, and you will learn to become like me. And so if we are going to be men and women of spiritual integrity, if we're going to be real people of faith, it cannot be a show, and it can't be merely once a week. It has to be our lives are lived in the secret place. That's the work. That is the work. That is the life. That is the point. It is waking up and making yourself happy as you can in the presence of God. And you do that every day, and you see what starts to happen as you spend time with Jesus. You become like Jesus, and then you start to do what Jesus did effortlessly. And then when you come to Sunday and you are worshiping, it's not because it's a show, it's because you've been shown how loved you are. And that's the overflow. And everything else now becomes the manifestation of the secret place. And so the way we develop spiritual integrity is by time with God alone. And for all the sinners here who say, I'm not doing great at that, the invitation is, come to me and start it today. Let's have some time together.